Good morning, good afternoon, and James, good evening. My name is Dan Elbaum, and I am AJC's Chief Advocacy Officer. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's new digital platform that allows our supporters to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy wherever you are. Today's program is brought to you in partnership with Jewish Insider. You can sign up for Jewish Insider's daily kickoff by visiting www.jewishinsider.com. With schools closed, businesses shuttered, and global markets in freefall, the coronavirus has upended our daily lives. Yet at AJC, we and our supporters look beyond our homes, our neighborhoods, and our portfolios. We want to know how the crisis is affecting our friends and community members around the world. With us to provide on-the-ground reports are Simone Rodan-Benzaquen, Director of AJC Europe, coming to us from Paris, Muriel Asseraf, AJC's representative in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and James Kim, an advisor and good friend to AJC's Asia Pacific Institute, and a research fellow at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies in Seoul, South Korea. After we hear from Simone, Muriel, and James, we'll take your questions. You may email your questions to questions, and questions is plural, at ajc.org, or use the Q&A feature in Zoom. Simone, with your permission, let me start with you. Obviously, we are all reading and watching TV coverage of what's going on in Europe, both in sympathy and solidarity, and also a horror of realizing that this is very shortly likely coming to us as well. There has been less coverage about the impact this is having on the European Jewish community. And many of us obviously have them on our mind as we've had during crises in the past. Obviously, understanding there are many European countries and different European Jewish communities are all very different. Could you give us an overview of how the crisis is affecting Europe's Jews?
Sure. So first of all, good morning or good afternoon for me. It's a pleasure to be with you, even to speak about such a difficult topic as this one. So just to give you a little bit of an overview generally about the situation in Europe, and then more specifically about the Jewish community here. So just as of today, or rather as of last night, we had 195,000 confirmed cases in Europe. Italy, of course, is the worst one. There are 63,000 cases, 6,000 confirmed deaths, followed by Spain, then Germany, even though Germany has many cases, 30,000, but relatively few deaths. There are 126, and then France with 19,000 cases, but 860 deaths. The UK that decided to do its shutdown last night with 6,650 cases and 335 deaths. So the situation is, of course, very, very serious. Many of our European countries have shut down the country entirely. This is certainly the case, for example, in France, where I'm sitting. So we have a total lockdown. We can only go out for grocery shopping, to pharmacies, and to walk in a very short while around our neighborhoods. That's it. And of course, no contacts with anyone. If you're walking outside, it is alone. Now, specifically how this affects the Jewish community. So first of all, largely, in many of the European countries, the Jewish community are overrepresented in the cases compared to the rest of the population. This is certainly the case in France. It's also the case in Italy. There have been many cases of Jewish community leaders, unfortunately. I have learned today, for example, that the president of the Consistoire, which is the religious body that deals with all Jewish affairs in France, is now in hospital. So is his wife, Joëlle Merrier, who is a good friend, and we are, of course, thinking of him today. There have been deaths. So we have a rabbi and a school dean who have both died here in France. The former leader of the Jewish community of Milan in Italy has also died. So it is affecting the Jewish community. The reason why this is the case is because, as it is estimated, these is typically people who are socializing. So they are dealing with communities, they are in synagogues. Let's also not forget that we had Purim, where many people came together, where of course many kids were present. So let's not forget that kids are often asymptomatic, but are that they can have a coronavirus and infecting others, of course. And so the Jewish community is dealing with it as much as possible. We have now in several European countries sort of crisis centers that have been established by the Jewish community. I'm in close touch with some of them, where the idea is basically to communicate as much as possible with Jewish communities, let them know that they cannot go to synagogue, that they have to take certain restrictions, that they cannot do minyans, that they can't, that can't go to Shabbat with their families. There have been videos that have been made by all major Jewish communities in Europe. There have been rabbis who've made videos to basically talk to their communities and tell them, please do stay at home, is the only reasonable thing to do. But as every day goes by, the community is trying to handle the community, but it is of course affecting it, and it is affecting also the way that we and they can deal with the issue of anti-Semitism, that of course has not disappeared, and that we are seeing in particular on social media. And of course the question of security is still a very important question. The question, for example, that there are many security personnel that within the Jewish community who are protecting synagogues. So the question is now, how do we protect them? How do we provide them with masks?
Simone, I want to ask you specifically about anti-Semitism in a moment, but just to follow up on something you said is, in the US, we're certainly reading coverage about non-compliance among the ultra-Orthodox or the Haredian community within Israel and somewhat within the United States as well. Obviously, that's an overgeneralization. Many are compliant, but some notable cases are not. Is a similar situation occurring in Europe?
Well, there are concerns for sure. There's nothing widespread at this stage. We're looking right now in the community of Antwerp, of course, where there are many Orthodox Jews. As of now, there is relative compliance, but of course it has to be surveyed. That's one of the reasons also why the Jewish community very proactively decided to solicit rabbis and Jewish community leaders to really communicate with the people to make sure that people do stay at home and do not go to their families, do not go to have minyans, do not go to have Shabbat.
Right. Okay. And I want to come back to you on the anti-Semitism and conspiracy theories, but that'll be a future question. So I know you're prepared, but to prepare you a little bit for that uplifting topic. Muriel, if I could turn to you for a moment, I think perhaps I'm reflective of some of our listeners in that I do want to hear about the Jewish communities of South America, but I know less about what's going on in terms of the virus, specifically in Latin America. Could you give us a bit of an overview of how the virus has affected the various different countries there?
Sure. Thank you so much, Dan. I do think that Latin America has not been on the front line. And for one reason is that I think the arrival of the virus has probably been delayed quite a bit because of its distance from Europe, from Asia, to a certain degree for the south of the continent, from the US as well. And I think that it's now become very clear that the virus is coming and is probably going to hit the continent just as hard as it's been hitting Europe or the United States. I think one of the most striking elements for the region is the challenge for a coordinated regional response. As you know, it's many countries. It's a continent that spans many different frontiers, borders, and peoples. And while some countries have adopted early measures, have closed down their land borders, and have prevented flights from Europe or Asia to land, others have really been a lot more reluctant and slower to do so. It's certainly the case in Brazil. It's been the case in Mexico, as you may have heard. At this point today, as I'm speaking to you, most countries in the region have imposed quarantines and lockdowns. It's certainly the case in São Paulo, Brazil, where I'm based. Businesses are closed, gyms are closed, museums, parks. Most of the economy has been slowed down to make sure that people stay home. But there has been a very big challenge in coordinating the federal, state, municipal governments with the state agencies and with the private sector. And this has been one of the reasons is that Latin America is one of the most unequal regions in the world, and more than a third of its population live in poverty. So that concern over the economic impact and the possible devastating social consequences of the epidemic are just as high a concern for most in the region as the health concerns. Some countries have now expanded their unemployment protections, have frozen rental payments, mortgages, loan payments, have adopted economic stimulus packages. But some analysts are saying that the complete lockdown that has been imposed in most of the region will not be sustainable for more than a few weeks in economies where a lot of people depend on their daily work to sustain themselves, and in countries where a lot of people live in communities that are overcrowded, where health attendance is certainly inadequate to face this epidemic, and where people need to go out of their houses, of their communities to make a living and feed their families.
Sure. Are there any countries that are particularly vulnerable at this point? I imagine everyone is, but are there one or two you could really highlight that we're really watching closely?
Yes, I think Venezuela is certainly a very, very high concern for many reasons. To date, there have been 84 cases reported in Venezuela. Venezuela has been facing a dire economic situation for a few years now. Its health system is completely lacking in all sorts of basic supplies, and I'm talking about running water in certain hospitals that are missing, that is not available. As a result, I think the death rate, analysts suggest that the death rate in Venezuela could be much higher than global averages. To make matters worse, in Venezuela, the price of oil, as you may have heard, has been driven to an 18-year low, while oil makes up 18% of the country's export earnings. So the country that's already been in a dire economic situation is probably looking at a very, very difficult situation in the months to come. I think there's also the question of Venezuelan refugees, which have fled the country since 2015. There are about 4.5 million of them in neighboring countries, including Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Brazil. And in many of these countries, it's not the case in Brazil, but in many of these countries, they live in informal situations, they lack access to healthcare, they live off of informal jobs. So they represent, I think, a challenge not only for Venezuela itself, but for a lot of the neighboring countries.
Wow.
I think, sorry.
No, I'm reacting. I didn't mean to cut you off, but that's...
No, I just wanted to say maybe a few words about Brazil, and or we can come back to this later.
Okay, so let's come back to Brazil in a moment, and maybe even hear a little bit more about Venezuela, a truly scary situation. James, thank you so much for joining us. I know it's late in the evening for you, and I want to thank you, and B, I want to congratulate you on winning the AJC Backdrop Award. This is the best one we've had for one of these calls in some time. So without trying to sound flip or irreverent, if there's a country that is seen as sort of winning throughout this coronavirus, and understanding there is no winning with the devastating toll that's there, but South Korea has managed to both change the curve and keep its economy running. I wonder if you could talk a little bit first about what South Korea has done and whether there are lessons to be learned from what the South Korean experience thus far, with understanding that this story is not yet over in any country, much less South Korea, or whether this is more relatable to a unique set of circumstances unique to South Korea.
Yeah, thanks for that, Dan. Yeah, I'd like to just reiterate that point that you made, that this is far from over. You take a look at these numbers, and it's not exactly clear whether we've actually tamed this virus. All it shows is that certain number of people were tested and certain number of people came out positive. We also know that this virus is asymptomatic at times, and it's still contagious, even though it's asymptomatic. There's very little that we know about this virus because the information that we've been getting from China has been somewhat limited at best. And it's not clear to me whether we have as good of information as we can from a lot of these countries, given how quickly this thing is spreading, right? So as long as we get, we don't have 400 cases coming up every day like we used to in the earlier part of this ordeal. I mean, the first patient that was identified was someone who came from Hubei on January 19th. That was patient number 1. But the case really started to explode, about a month after that, in February. And most of those cases were not in Central Seoul. They were in Daegu, of all places, which is further to the south in the Gyeongsang province, to the east, southeast. It's one of the major cities there. And it's interesting that we haven't seen the explosion in Seoul and Busan. But my guess, as well as other experts, is that there are cases there. So as long as we're getting a handful of cases that are coming up, people are still going to be very suspicious. They're going to be weary. And one of the biggest impacts of this virus is that it breeds mistrust. And also people get more, people become more careful around other people. It increases the level of distance, the isolation within the society. So, so it will definitely have some social impact. For instance, my son hasn't been going to school for close to a month now. The schools have been closed for a month. The way that the government is operating on these decisions about the school is to, instead of close them down for the whole semester, they're taking it on a 2-week basis. So the decision, there are a lot of uncertainties. You know that there's no school for 2 weeks, and then it's not clear where there's going to be school until the day before the second week is up. So we've had 2 rounds of this, and it's now a month, and people are still anxious. Are we going to have to wait another 2 weeks? And then another 2 weeks after that? And meanwhile, the schools are trying to figure out how to set up the curriculum and handle this semester. The students also, as well as the parents, they're not exactly sure how to handle this either. So there's a lot of frustration and anxiety that's building, and it's not clear how this is going to, if at all, explode in some way. I mean, we have an election coming up next month on the 15th. I suspect that it might have some impact, and that's only on the school and education side. Economy, I think the impact is we're already seeing the impact on the economic side. Kospi is down. It's usually around the 2,000 band. It's down to about 1,600 now. It went down as low as 1,400s, and it recovered a bit. But the dollar to one ratio is at its worst. We haven't seen these numbers since the 2008-2009 financial crisis. So the government recently announced a huge stimulus package yesterday, about $80 billion. They've been holding out on this, but I suspect that these packages will continue to come as long as it's, it's creating bottlenecks in the economy. People aren't able to go to work on time. They're not able to use public transportation. So, the rush hour will have to be staggered. So I go into work sometimes at 10 a.m., come back at 4 p.m. Some of my colleagues go in a little earlier and maybe leave a little bit earlier than I do. A lot of teleworking, but teleworking only if the companies see actual cases. So they're trying to keep the economic activity going. But whenever a case arises, you're going to have to, they typically end up teleworking and closing the workplace down and everybody having to work from home. So it's very irregular. These irregularities create, not really a conducive environment for high degree of productivity in the workplace either. So we're far from having worked this out, and I think the economic impact and the social impact is huge. The impact on the health side doesn't, I think that doesn't need to be. I don't have to say much there. Right. Even though the cases indicate that it's sort of leveled off, people are still very anxious because it's not the coronavirus itself that is, that is the sole cause of death among many of these people. It's existing preconditions or some other conditions that is exacerbated by the virus.
Right.
So who's at risk? It's not, it seems to be the case that most of the people are older, but we're seeing some of these cases that are on the younger side as well. And so there isn't enough information for everybody to be comfortable. And some people are taking risks. I mean, we've had this for about 2 months now, and people are kind of fed up. So they're starting to go out now. They're starting to go to the restaurants. The restaurants can't stay closed, so they're starting to open some of the restaurants. We're reading about newspaper articles about kids going to nightclubs, thinking that they're immune to the virus.
Nightclubs are open.
Yeah, some of the nightclubs are open in Gangnam, as crazy as that sounds.
Is there, sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but is there general, it's funny, it's not, none of this is funny, obviously, but I'm in my second week of having the kids at home. You're in your second month. So I'm thinking about what's coming in terms of a future, but is there general support for the measures that the government has taken? I mean, obviously I hear you that people are pent up. It's been 2 months, it's been too long, but is there a general sense that the government has handled this in an effective way, or are people unhappy with all this?
I think it's split right now. Initially, when the cases started to, come under control, people were fairly optimistic. But as this thing gets even more longer, I think people are starting to get very frustrated. And it's the impact on the jobs and these other things that's also adding on the sort of resentment against the government. And they just imposed some, bans on religious activities because, as you know, the case in Daegu was a religious organization. So some of the churches here are complaining that they can't hold service. Some of the services are being held on the internet, but not everybody have access to the internet. So it's a very difficult situation. Not anybody really knows exactly how to deal with this. And meanwhile, the government is trying to somehow keep the economy going, keep the activities going without having this thing go out of hand. But so it's unclear to me whether there's a really good answer here. Even though the South Korean government seems to be doing really well, and the foreign press globally is giving South Korea good marks, I don't think everybody here is very happy with what's going on. And a lot of people are saying that we should have closed off the borders very, very early. As I told you, the first case was on January 19th. It wasn't until February 4th that they restricted entry for people from Hubei province in China. So a lot of these travel restrictions came on in March. So basically what the government is doing is trying to manage this and trying to lengthen this out until we get to some point where a reliable therapeutic is developed or vaccine is announced. But meanwhile, you're going to have to rack up these problems, not only with schools and these inconveniences, but also with lives.
Okay, thank you. Simone, I think we've all accepted that anti-Semitism flourishes during times of uncertainty, during times of panic, that in other forms of prejudice as well. If you're a student of history as well, you know that during the plagues and other times of viruses, that also scapegoating and rampant anti-Semitism has occurred. What are you seeing today, both in features on the dark web and anti-Semitism conspiracy theories? What is out there right now that specifically relates to the Jewish community?
First of all, yes, you're absolutely right. I think all of us who study history a little bit and in sociology knew right from the beginning that we would probably be seeing quite a bit of conspiracy theories, that we would be seeing quite a bit of conspiracy theories related to Jews, and we are still seeing really the first very clear symptoms. In France, in particular, there have been quite a few stories blaming the Jews, blaming Zionists, in particular, of course, on social media, where the problem was already very present, but now people have a lot of time, people have a lot of energy, and so more and more of this is spreading. We have seen in particular one story making the rounds over the last couple of days, and AJC, we have been quite a little bit involved in highlighting it, in particular today, and also being in touch with the different institutions, the government, etc. The former Minister of Health, Agnès Buzyn, who is the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, has been at the center stage of a huge amount of conspiracy theories. She was the Minister of Health, then stepped down in order to be a candidate for the majority party to run to become the mayor of Paris. Her husband, Mr. Levy, has been in charge of a health institution, and so they have basically been held responsible for the crisis, for preventing, in particular, the fact that France is using one of the medications, potential medications that could be used. I'm not going to go into detail of the medication, but this has been really making the rounds. And I fear it's going to become very, very, very prevalent. So we are working, of course, with other institutions, with other non-profit organizations, with watchdogs, with the government authorities, to make sure that all of this is being surveilled, and if necessary, if when it incites hatred and violence, can potentially be taken off. Again, we at AJC in Europe have been concentrating on incitement to hatred and hate speech online, anti-Semitism online for quite a while. So we're pretty prepared, if I may say so, to be able to deal with that. But I think we will be seeing much more of this, and we'll be holding actually specific online events on the particular subject of conspiracy theories online and conspiracy theories with relations to anti-Semitism online over the next few weeks.
No, thank you, Simone. And for those who are joining us who are not AJC regulars, you should know that Simone, as our European director in Paris, oversees colleagues not only in Paris but also in Brussels, Berlin, Rome, London, and Warsaw, as well as several other partner communities across Europe. So it is a wide-ranging group of colleagues we are obviously all concerned and are all doing their work under very difficult circumstances. Muriel, if I could turn to you, and I want to drill down specifically a little bit about the Jewish communities of Latin America, where hopefully we're not seeing anti-Semitism on the level that Simone described yet, but could you talk a little bit about how different communities are responding to the crisis?
Sure, thank you, Dan. So first of all, let me say that Jewish communities in Latin America is not a monolithic group, as you may very well know, and I'm going to try to speak about a few communities. You should know that BILA has been in touch, my institute has been in touch with all of our institutional partners across the region. So we've been able to follow what has been going on in their communities and support them however we could. And I want to give you maybe, hopefully, a little bit of a positive picture of what's going on here. First of all, Latin America is not a place that has been known for being a center of anti-Semitism. And I think this has always been the case. We've seen a much fewer spread of anti-Semitic acts than Europe or even the United States has seen. So this is good news already. But I think that there's certain communities right now have been even shown for their good work in their societies. And this has been a positive development. I want to speak specifically about the Mexican Jewish community. You should know that Mexico has been slow. The Mexican government has been slow in imposing quarantines and lockdowns. And the Jewish community in the country was one of the first ones to really take action. They've closed down their schools even before the government has ordered the closing down of schools. They've taken measures to set up a hospital, a center in one of their community centers, to transform the center into a hospital where they could welcome members of the communities and treat them. And when they made these announcements in the press, the response was overwhelmingly positive. So I think this has been an incredibly uplifting case where a Jewish community has acted very responsibly, has given very early signs of a positive response to the epidemic, and has been complemented by their peers in the society. I think across the continent, we've seen communities organize themselves, abiding by rules or imposing rules. In Brazil, services have been shut down, or physical services and meetings have been at synagogues have been closed down even before the quarantine was imposed. I know that in Brazil specifically, the community has been working very hard to make sure that its most vulnerable members would be attended to, in terms of, providing food for the more elderly people among us, in terms of also providing psychological support for those among the community members who might be feeling the pressure and the anxiety of the quarantine and the lockdown. So I think this is the case in most countries. In Peru, in Argentina, the communities have been organizing themselves to try and continue providing their services in a different, more creative way. So I know that here, for example, most synagogues are providing services online. Rabbis are sending out messages and online courses where people can feel at least supported and part of the community. And really the focus has been on making sure that the most vulnerable among the communities are still being attended to, which is becoming every day a little bit more challenging with all the restrictions that have been imposed.
Terrific. Wow. James, I'll turn to you with a final question before we turn it over to audience members. And I know we're getting several questions. If you do have a question, remember you can either use the Zoom chat feature or say question, or email us at questions@ajc.org. To put it mildly, the dynamic between China and the United States has taken a few interesting turns over the last month or so, last few months, I'd say. Could you give us a read of how that is all being interpreted in South Korea?
China increasingly is becoming more, how should I say, it's a difficult neighbor, in the sense that part of the reason why the travel restrictions to China didn't come, for the broader China, didn't come until mid-February, when this was in full swing in Daegu. And we had close to 200, 400 cases coming out. Part of the reason why the government waited for like a whole month on this was because there was a tremendous amount of pressure that was being applied to China, from China to South Korea. And this was also the case in Japan. So in particular, Xi Jinping was essentially dangling his potential visit to Korea as a leverage to say, if you restrict travel for Chinese mainlanders into Korea, then I may not visit Korea. And this was the same threat that he used to Prime Minister Abe. And also he added on top of that potential attendance to Chinese national team to the to now postponed Japanese Summer Games, the Olympics. So in both cases in Seoul and Tokyo, I think both leaders somewhat caved to that pressure. They didn't like it, but they didn't see exactly what to do about it. Meanwhile, the United States, I thought, moved very, very quickly on imposing travel restrictions on China, but was very slow to impose travel restrictions on Korea and Japan when they knew that there was a risk there. Right. So it was a very different treatment, and clearly for the Koreans on how this issue was handled with regards to travel restrictions, it was night and day between Beijing and the United States. Now, your point about the U.S.-China competition, we're now seeing escalation in South China Sea, near Taiwan. We think that China may be using this opportunity to test U.S. resolve and how it's going to handle the Taiwan question. If China does the same with South Korea or Japan, I think it will be a very difficult, it would be a challenging time because as you know, Washington is completely preoccupied with handling this issue and making sure that, the economy is okay and public health is in good order in the United States. So this is, it's not good if China starts to test the United States because they think that they have this under control. Could there be a potential for miscalculation? Yeah, that's a worry. Putting aside the security, the environment and the potential risks there, could the China-US trade competition or trade war resurface? And would that have a huge impact on South Korea? Yeah, that's a worry. But I think even greater worry for South Koreans right now is, how's the US economy going to hold up? Is it going to be robust? Will they be able to keep the market open through this ordeal? Or is this going to overwhelm the American economy? And we're going to see a recession like no other. I mean, South Korea depends very heavily on its trade with the United States, just as much as it does with China. And on the investment side, on the financial side, dollar is very, very important here. There's a huge dollar shortage in Korea, as well as other parts of the world. So the integrity of the dollar and the U.S. economy, very, very important. Even more so than the competition with China. So while that's lurking in the background, I think the more immediate concern is, how's the U.S. going to handle the economic fallout from this?
Right. No, and how it affects not only South Korea, but the world at large. Let me turn it over to my colleague, Allie Lipner, who has some questions from the audience.
Thanks so much, Dan. I just want to remind everyone that you can email questions, that's question plural, at ajc.org to ask a question, or you can use the chat feature in Zoom. James, our first question is to you. It's from AJ CEO David Harris, who's on the line. And he wants to know if we know about the state of the virus in North Korea. Given North Korea's close relations with China, how has Pyongyang handled this dimension? And are North and South Korea cooperating in response to the pandemic?
Well, thank you for that question. And it's great to get a question from David Harris. I hope if he's listening, hi, David. Miss you and looking forward to seeing you again. Hopefully, once the travel restriction is lifted, I'm back in the stateside. I'll pay a visit in New York, and hopefully we can all laugh about this. But in any case, right now, very serious. North Korea, we don't know much about what's going on in North Korea. What's interesting about that is, I think we could assume, and the reports that are coming out that suggest that North Korea does have cases of coronavirus. But North Korea, just like China, even more so than China, is able to impose really strict restrictions on travel, on quarantine, things that we cannot do in the normal democracies, right? Nor ones with open market economies. So North Korea has an edge there in how they could handle this. And the leader clearly does not care about its people. We know that from the track record that we've seen on human rights. So the number of casualties, it doesn't care much about. Both the United States and South Korea has extended assistance to North Korea, but time and time again, North Korea has refused. We've seen lately some missiles being fired. These are solid fuel missiles, which are very concerning to most experts because this is the building block for an ICBM. And so, and the question here is, why is that? Why would they refuse help? Well, guess what? They still think that they're negotiating with the United States, and they don't want to use this chip. If they get some kind of support from South Korea or the United States, they're going to have to give something else in return. And they don't want to lose that leverage. So while they're negotiating, they want to negotiate from a position of strength. And what that means is they don't want to look weak. and they certainly don't want to, reach out and say, help us. So unfortunately for the North Korean people, this is how it looks like it is. We don't know enough about these cases to know how bad it is in North Korea. And I would suspect, based on what we're seeing in not only South Korea, but also in Italy and other places, that it's not good. And I don't think they're out of the woods either.
Right. And it seems like the regime has made a calculated decision that it's better for more people to die than to show weakness.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Great. Our next question, yep, sure. Our next question is from AJC board member Melanie Nelkin in Atlanta. And Melanie would like to know from Muriel and from Simone if there have been any communal plans put in place to celebrate Passover in a way that's safe for those in quarantine.
For now, there are conversations within the community, within most of the European Jewish communities, to basically create contingency plans. The idea being that most probably Passover will not be able to take place the usual way, meaning that families will not be able to come together. Synagogues will not be open in most of the European countries. But at this stage, we're sort of still in a contingency plan to evaluate how this is going to be put in place. Most of it will probably be online. There will probably be things that will be sent to people, but it seems as of now that it's pretty clear that that this will not be able to take place the usual manner.
In terms of what's going on in Brazil, I think we need to remember that Brazil has just started its quarantine and its lockdown. So we're a little bit behind in terms of the timing, and we're expecting probably a peak in number of contaminations and deaths towards the end of April and in May. So it is very unlikely that any of the measures will be lifted before Passover, before the commemoration of Passover. And it is very likely that people will be, just as Simone has said in Europe, it is very likely that people will have to find ways to connect otherwise, online or through different means. But I think we're looking here at a scenario where, you know, the governor of the state of São Paulo has now announced a 2-week complete lockdown, pretty similar, I think, to what Simone has been describing in France, with great concern that this may just be the very beginning of a much longer scenario. So I think we're really all looking at this as the first phase of what's coming.
Great, thank you. We have several questions coming in that are along the same line. So I'll direct this to you first, James. A lot of people are wondering what the economic stimulus in Brazil, France, and South Korea might be looking like, since the U.S. government is in the midst of negotiating several relief packages. So James, let's start with you.
Well, the government's been imposing all kinds of different measures and mixes. First thing that it's done is it's banned or outlawed short selling in the Korean stock market because they're afraid of capital flight and people leveraging sort of the Korean financial market going down and shorting Korean markets. So they've done that first to try to get the large hedge fund to not do this. They're also they have these other, for instance, the stimulus package that they announced today was mainly for small businesses, and clearly I think the biggest losers here are going to be those in the service sector with small businesses. Different provincial governors and cities have talked about the kinds of things that's being discussed in the Senate right now. And I don't know if the vote has happened this morning. I read last night that Congress Senate was going to vote on this bill. and the administration is talking about it like, you know, $1,000 per adult, or what is it, $1,500 per adult, as the Democrats are talking about. The Koreans have talked a bit about, you know, somewhere near $300 to $500 for the adults, but I haven't.
In China,
I haven't
he
heard.
gets his wholesale or closed because of coronavirus. What percentage of your business?
Sorry, James, I'm not sure what the sound is,
No.
but keep trying to
Okay.
bear with us, and we'll get it.
Low
Yeah.
interest.
So basically, I think that I think what I'm hearing from. Okay.
Simone, are you
I guess
watching a
that's
video
fine.
on your computer?
I'm not.
Okay, I think we fixed it.
So yeah, so let me go back. And most of the supports are for small businesses, and then some loans, loan support, or low interest loans. The Bank of Korea has also announced certain monetary measures. They're dipping into the reserves. They've lowered the interest rates by 50 basis points. So they're doing similar things that, and they're taking the cue from the Federal Reserve and also what Washington is doing, and then they're looking at what other countries like Japan is doing potentially, but at the moment, a lot of this is supplemental spending increase that's coming in waves. And again, it's not happening all in a big lump sum, like the way that I think the US is moving very, very quickly. But the way that, as I've explained it to you, the South Korean government, the way it's doing it is every 2 weeks, and they reassess, and they try to see if they need to do more.
Right.
Great. Simone or Muriel, why don't you go ahead and talk about the economic response?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think it's important to note that the economic response is just starting to now come, because there's been a lot of disagreement as to what measures needed to be taken up until a couple of days ago. You may have seen that our president, President Bolsonaro, up until a week ago was still going out to demonstrations, kissing people, shaking hands, trying to really show that this virus wasn't going to have any consequences on Brazil, that we were stronger. And he really had a lot of discussions with the state and with municipalities when they started implementing quarantines and lockdowns. So up until very recently, there was no real discussion of any sort of economic package, because local authorities, municipalities, and governors were the ones who were making these restrictions. And the president was pretty reluctant to taking these discussions. But they're now, of course, in the thick of discussing these packages. As I said before, these societies, in Brazil in particular, is a very unequal society where a lot of the people have informal jobs. And the fact that they can't go to work on a daily basis is really going to impact them very strongly on a very short-term basis. So there are two kinds of measures, I think. Some of them are very short-term and some of them are longer-term. Some of them are meant to empower or to at least sustain, I want to say more exactly, to sustain the livelihood of the most vulnerable ones, of those that are more in need. So the president is going to probably open up some subsidies for lower income workers and for people who have lost their daily jobs. He's going to cut the debt on certain states to the union, to the Brazilian union, to the federal union, to make sure that they have enough funds to fund their local responses to the crisis. I think the entire package is now going to probably amount to about 88 billion reais in different kinds of measures with cities and with states. I think that probably states like São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro are going to be the targets of more subsidies than other states, because it seems like, at least for now, the virus has been hitting São Paulo a lot harder, a lot harsher than any of the other states in the union. some of these measures, it seems like credit lines, like the flexibilization of the work, of the labor code, which is also something that's going to be very heavy for smaller and medium-sized companies, will have an effect in the longer term. And I think that these are credit lines and debt rearrangements that they're hoping will prevent a lot of these businesses from closing down.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, yes, there have been numerous numerous initiatives by different European countries. First of all, France was, I think, France was one of the strongest, where Emmanuel Macron right away said that he would not let any of the companies, including small and medium companies, die. So there have been all sorts of initiatives, basically where the government will pay when people will go are not able to go to work, that the salaries are being paid. There are all sorts of additional spending, both in two of the biggest economies, in Germany and in France, with respectively 500 billion and 350 billion economic packages. The European Commission also has said that that they will suspend any mechanisms that up until now were the case, where the countries, the European member countries used to have the necessity to have not too much spending. So these are also abandoned. So yes, there are a number of economic stimulus packages for several European countries, but I think overall there is, of course, a sort of a clear understanding that we are probably going into a recession that will, depending on how long it will last, can be bad to extremely bad.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Simone, Muriel, and James, for joining us today. We wish you and your families, most importantly, continued good health during this time of crisis. I also want to thank the community for joining us today, as well as our partners at Jewish Insider. In addition, AJC is encouraging and highlighting acts of kindness during the crisis as part of its our newly launched Be a Mensch campaign. Visit ajc.org/beamensch, that's BEAMENSCH, to submit your own story of Menschy behavior or share it on social media using the hashtag #BeAMensch. Once again, thank you all so much for joining today. Thank you to my colleagues and friends who took the time to join us and share their insights. We wish you all continued good health during this very difficult time. And please be assured of AJC's commitment to continue to employ this type of programming and to provide our analysis from around the world as the coronavirus continues to spread. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.